Hello there, and welcome to those of you who are newer to the channel. Those of you who have been around a little bit longer will probably have a bit of a memory of me doing something like this before. Those of you who are newer, though, will be thinking, what on earth is this all about? I thought this was an automotive channel, a gaming channel. Well, it is, first and foremost, but I do have other passions outside of YouTube, and I'll probably be releasing this video on both channels, the second channel being HSG Unlimited as well. So, for those who don't know anything about me besides that I do tunes in Forza and talk about Gran Turismo 7 news, I love to write as well. And a couple of years ago on the channel, I did a video wherein I announced publishing my first two books. My first book, called Buddy, and a follow-up called Spore. Now, the two stories are not connected. They're completely different to each other. Buddy, and I'm not going to fully get into it because of course I did that video, but put simply, Buddy is a psychological coming-of-age, not quite horror, not quite thriller. I guess you could call it more of a very violent drama, in effect. And then Spore is my love letter to my favourite kind of cinema, because I'm a huge movie buff as well, and my favourite kind of cinema is horror, specifically creature features and monster movies. So Spore is my tribute to that. Buddy follows a young boy who's bullied at school, who meets a stranger who's something of a vigilante, and this vigilante stranger offers to help the boy deal with the bullies at school, but it ends up being in some ultra-violent ways which go far too far. The second book, Spore, is about a girl in her late teens attending an illegal rave in the woods. The rave is broken up by police, and she finds herself waking up in the back of a police car on the way to the station, and then she has to fight for survival against a creature of some kind outside the car, which is attacking them. This one is much more of like a traditional horror flick. This one is much more cerebral, much more psychological and thoughtful. This one is designed to be read twice as well, whereas this one's a bit more popcorn. The purpose of this video, though, because of course I went further in depth in the last video a couple of years ago about those, back in, must have been around 2018, but the purpose of this video is to announce my third book, which is now out on Amazon, called Those That Remain. Now this one is similar in length to Spore. Once again, completely different genre. It's within the overarching category of kind of horror, kind of thrillers with drama in there. But this one specifically, I would say, is a small, personal, claustrophobic zombie drama. So this is my first zombie story. A viral zombie outbreak, 28 days later kind of style, rather than Romero's zombies. And it follows the story of one lone survivor from his group who has taken shelter on a small fishing boat and is reminiscing over the events that transpired to him and his friends over the preceding weeks, their final weeks together, dealing with his issues and trauma associated with that. And he also has in his possession a potential cure, a possible prototype cure for this virus which has taken over the world, but he needs to try it out potentially on himself in order to know whether or not it works. And it's basically him coping with his inner demons, processing what's happened to him and the people that he loves and knows, and trying to decide whether or not to make this potentially lethal decision for himself to find out whether or not this cure works. So that's the essential idea of Those That Remain. This is actually a story which has had concepts which I've been thinking about for years. In fact, this story's origins are years old at this point. I remember as far back as 2016 telling my dad, who of course was then living, about the concept behind this story. And he loved the concept. He actually said it was the most tragic story that I'd come up with, and he loved it for that. And because those who have read my books or are familiar with my books, you know that I love tragic stories. Tragedies appeal to me. I'm not exactly sure why. I like the realism of it. Well, as an example, my favourite movie of all time, which incidentally is based on a novella, John Carpenter's The Thing from 1982. Spoiler alert for those who haven't seen it, it's a tragedy-filled movie. It's a tragic movie by its very theme, and yet it's not a movie which people are upset by, because the tragedy within that film feels appropriate. It feels like that's the only way that things could have panned out, and people love the movie, myself included. to me, that has always inspired me to think, well, you can 100% write endings that are not cliched Hollywood sugarcoat, but at the same time feel appropriate and satisfying when you read, to the point where you may even want to read it again. And I think that that's sometimes a difficult thing to achieve. I'd like to think that I've achieved that with at least one or two of my books, and obviously people who've read them would have to tell you that. I know that some of you in the community have read my books. I actually give copies, digital copies of these books, for free to those who support the channel on Patreon, I believe at the $5 tier and up. So if you want to read all three of them for $5, albeit not in physical form, as email versions in PDFs, then that's an easy way to do it, because on Amazon, and there'll be a link to the UK Amazon marketplace, but you can get it on basically any marketplace you want, on Amazon, of course. All three of my books are on there. So if you want the paperback, I personally like the paperback, because it's just nice to have a physical copy of it. For those who do want the physical copies, this one I think is like £4, $3.99, which is like $5, something like that, so they're not expensive. And in effect, if you support the channel on Patreon, you're getting 3 for $5 instead. But it's the digital versions, obviously. So that's the payoff to me. I will always love having physical versions of books, because to me it's just cooler to be able to actually hold it, especially when it's something that I've actually written myself, because it's just a nice feeling to have that tangible version of something that you've created. Now, something which I believe I did in that first video for Buddy and Spore was even to read out a little bit of it as a teaser. So that is what I'm going to do with those that remain now as well, for those who are curious. And as a little bonus, some of you might remember this, but I actually published a free audiobook story, in effect, here on the channel, probably at least a year ago at this point, called A Room Called Sin. So if you'd like to hear one of my books or one of my stories without paying anything, it's literally here on the channel. The entire thing is in a video. But without any further ado, let's read a little bit of a teaser from those that remain to give you a taste of the kind of style, etc. The book itself, incidentally, is a little bit of a different style, a different font, and a different layout. But let's see where we should read from. So I'll start reading at a fairly random point in the book, kind of throwing you into the action, and if you like what you hear, then I guess check out more. They stood in silence for a few seconds, listening to hear for pattering of feet or rapid breathing below. Not a sound. They quietly walked down the steps as swiftly as they could, holding their shoes in their hands and descending the steps in their socks. As they reached the ground floor, they chose the rear door to exit the building, as Emily had jumped from the front window, and this was doubtless where the majority of the infected were still gathered. Colin's eyes opened suddenly in the boat, snapped out of his dozing by the clatter of his pen rolling off the desk and onto the floor. He looked down at the research journal laid out in front of him and remembered where he was, wiping at his eyes as his thoughts flashed back to the dream he was having of that awful day. He closed the book and it slid off to one side, picking up the cheap veneer of the table with his thumb as his thoughts drifted back to the past. He felt himself beginning to doze off again and stood up, peering out of the window at the moon shining over the rippling water, which had gained some movement in the past hour or so, now swaying the boat a little as it sat moored on the docks. Beyond the occasional sloshing of water against the hull, there was barely a sound to be heard, and he decided to pack it in for the night and get some rest, turning to switch off the glow of the sun jar. But just as he drew his hand back from switching it off, a faint scratching sound caught his attention from outside the boat, like something poking at the side of the ship. The sound seemed rhythmic, happening every couple of seconds, a dull, scratchy whine. He turned his head to hear more accurately where the sound was coming from, its volume seemingly increasing with each passing. As he moved toward the rear of the cabin, Colin realised what the noise was. And I'm going to leave it there. So, as I said, each of my books is within the overarching genre of, I would say, like tension as a genre, if that even is a genre. As I said, the first one, Buddy, because all of these are still available. You don't have to buy the new one, obviously, if one of the others appeals to you more. Coming-of-age psychological horror, in effect. Buddy is also probably the most violent of the three, I would say. The second one, Spore. Creature feature survival horror through and through. My love letter to horror cinema. And then, of course, my newest one, Those That Remain. A personal, introspective zombie survival drama. So if any of those sound like they interest you, obviously I'm very proud of just finishing them at all, because a lot of the time when I was a kid especially, I used to start writing stuff and never get it finished. So if any of those sound like they appeal to you, then obviously check them out on Amazon. Or, as I said, the way to get all three of them instantly in an email without, unfortunately, having the paperback versions is to jump over to Patreon and join any of the tiers from $5 up, and you'll get all three. Plus, as part of that tier, for those who do choose to check it out, you get all future releases as well. So, for instance, now that I publish Those That Remain, before it was just these two. So all the Patreon members who are still supporting the channel have got this already. So, as I said, if that interests you, check it out. The video doesn't really fall into any of the categories of stuff that I would usually make, but writing and thinking up stories, especially as movies first and then on paper, has always been a huge passion of mine. So yeah, I like to share my passions here on the channel occasionally, especially on the second channel, HSG Unlimited as well. So I want to thank you for checking out this vid. Check out the first vid back when I first released Buddy and Spore if you want to know more about those. And until next time, I'll see you then. But thanks for joining me. And as always, thanks for watching.